서는 결심하면 한다.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come all you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way. So Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortune he has seen, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
전체의 사회주의를 우리 어떻게 정대로 지키는가를 세계여보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 승리의 영도 따라서 선군의 붉은 기 그 신념으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 조체의 강성대국을 우리 어떻게 이 땅에 세우는가를 세계여보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 장군님의 국의 뜻을 받들어 불굴의 정신력 그대 장으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 결심하면 한다. 조선 한다면 한다.
Ягод негнал тим терекчи
진달하게 보지마 던지니 헌칠세 어거지민 헌칠세 내 때문이 소스테홍 내린지 바다를 흘려쇼
in Slovakia, you have.
Welcome back. It's us again, as a band once says. And it is the latest episode, episode 11, in fact, of the Decline and Fall program. Joining me, as always, from an undisclosed location in the once and future Yugoslavia, it's Kit Clarenberg.
Hey, Alex, how's it going?
Going pretty well, man. Indeed, we have an awful lot to get our respective teeth into this week, I think.
Always.
Chaos reigns. The agent of chaos, in this case, is a certain Mr. Donald J. Trump, who happens to be president of the United States. He is apparently a man who knows how to bear certain grudges and comes in with a clear, I think, a clear agenda to clear certain decks and reorientate certain priorities. And we are talking about, of course, the story that we started talking about last week, which is Trump's agenda when it comes to US aid, National Endowment for Democracy, and other employment programs for retired Trotskyites in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. So, Kit, in the last 7 days since we were last broadcasting, what has gone on, and what, from your vantage point in a country which has been subjected to the depredations of the US, shall we say, NGO industrial complex, what is the significance of the changes that are being wrought in Washington, D.C. right now?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting to spectate this stuff from the kind of outer imperial core. I think
Mm,
people living within the inner imperial core, which is to basically say the Five Eyes English speaking spying network that
mm,
operates globally, just because, why not? And with total impunity for illegal mass surveillance and all sorts of other criminal activity. The and kind of Western Europe to an extent, like people do not understand the extent to which the global South in general, but like specifically the former Soviet sphere and the former Yugoslavia since call it 1989.
yes.
There was a US colonization of the entire former almost entire former Yugoslavia up until 2000. Throughout the 90s, country after country was forcibly, in many cases, absorbed into the clutches of NATO and the EU, and this was primarily and subject to US economic domination and the destruction of their local industries, reduced in, as we have discussed many times, Alex, to effective markets for goods and commodities made elsewhere, and for resources to be raped and pillaged for the profit of Western oligarchs. So, like when you're not in at the kind of front line of what we might call where the US empire has really begun to unravel, like very visibly.
Mm,
You have countries like Bosnia where effectively in the half of Bosnia, which is helpfully called Bosnia and Herzegovina, as is the country official name,
mm,
the Bosniak and Croat half of Bosnia, every basic function of government is carried out by private US contractors with funding from US aid and
mm,
Soros and other, I am not, this is not an exaggeration, like the most basic things, including the supply of water,
mm,
the building of hospitals and schools, the running of youth clubs, the management of parking in
mm,
Sarajevo, like it's all run by USAID and USAID funded NGOs. And US officials have openly and repeatedly threatened Bosnian governments that if you don't bend your knee to us, and if you don't enact this reform or cut this or privatize this or sell this to
mm,
foreign investors, then we're going to cut off all aid to you. And then that's going to reduce you to the post-war rubble that you found yourself in 1995, like without a functioning educational healthcare system, right?
yes.
So like that's the level of penetration of USA. And I think that, and you've got to bear in mind as well that this completely appalling, unworkable system is backed up in Bosnia, and also similarly, very similar sort of story in Kosovo, by tens of thousands of foreign soldiers
Mm.
in the form of quote unquote peacekeepers, whether they be NATO or the UN, who typically just stand by and spectate, if not facilitate, very serious ethnically motivated crimes, usually. And just stand by and do nothing,
Mm.
while to even attempt to resolve the problem they're supposed to resolve. Meanwhile, under threat of force, privatization has been carried out. The takeover of what remained of civil society and the state, including the police force, was taken by force by NATO peacekeepers in the mid-90s, and very little has changed today. It's not to the penetration in Serbia is not to the same extent, but it's not massively far off, I would say, in some ways. And I think there are entire sectors of the economy that wouldn't exist without US funding. And there is I published a thread on Twitter which got quite a bit of traction. I made the point that basically that on top of serving as effective regime change and propaganda foot soldiers, when creating this shadow NED USAID, effectively CIA shadow political structure that can be mobilized to stir up unrest when governments don't act as required. It also creates this kind of colonial style forced dependency where nobody for example, Bosnia does anything for themselves because everything is in private hands. Everything. Yes. The management of the most the things that you would never expect in a million years are being they are being financed, whether overtly or semi-overtly, via USAID or another kind of US intelligence front organization. And it also means that you have this vast army of people who can not only pump out pro-Western propaganda and serve as regime change agents, but it also means that more widely, people are very careful about what they say publicly about certain topics. Okay. Even if they're not part of this NGO blob in the Balkans, they might need to be or want to be if they want to work in a particular field. Like if you want to work, if you want to work in disability rights, you're going to have to deal with US contractors or US organizations like NED and USAID. So that there are things that you can and cannot say. Otherwise, you are not going to be employed. It's a very good way of wedging entire populations or significant proportions of local populations under the heel of the US empire's large S, because again, being on the front line of this, I have seen offices with the lights off. There are vast protests at the moment in Serbia. I dare say that there is a proportion of people who are there because the NGO they are working for isn't functional. As I have saw someone post on Twitter, and I have reshared and included in the show notes, since Trump's inauguration in USAID head office, 390 people have lost their jobs. And the knock-on they've been fired from USAID HQ in Washington, which means the kind of knock-on effect of that all over the world is going to be absolutely huge. Because these could be, at least in some cases, senior people at a director level who are managing projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars globally, and suddenly they're gone.
Yeah. Well, as we talked about last week, this implies then that there is at least a section of the US ruling class which is aligned with Trump, who are serious about a re-evaluation, as the executive order we're sharing on the screen indicates, entitled Re-evaluating and Realigning United States Foreign Aid. And if we pause just for a second to consider what Kit's just been saying about the reality of so-called foreign aid, Trump's reasoning, which always comes in the form of saying, oh, we're getting ripped off by all these countries. I mean, that's just for domestic consumption. Trump might believe it himself. Foreign aid is not about, largesse to the population as a whole. It is about opening doors for US, British, Western European capital to go in and despoil a place, asset strip it, and reduce the population to being sort of dependent slaves of neocolonialism. Essentially, That's very shorthand, but that's what it is. So if Trump then is, and again, he might have come up with some of these ideas, but not all of it will be him. There's clearly a much more organized effort this time around to shut some of this down and to realign it. And what
Mm,
it reveals, I think, is probably the end point of the form of neo-colonialism, which has been practiced by the US in particular since 89, as you were saying. So that period is coming to a close. We're going
mm,
towards, I would think, something that is much more direct, much more dependent upon brute force. And in
mm,
actual fact, in some ways, it's easier to deal with because, as you were saying, the whole point of this NED USAID driven order since the early 90s is that this could only operate when there was no conceivable challenge to the US. As soon
yeah.
as a conceivable challenge emerges, be it in the form of China's sheer economic power, Russia's military power, you can't run this form of neocolonialism anymore. Doesn't work. Because what's being revealed is that for all the so-called cultural power of the US and the British, that's actually like a castle built on sand because there's no base behind it anymore, or not as much of an industrial base that you would need to sustain this kind of this effort. So therefore, this is being revealed to be completely hollow now. And so I think this is probably what lies behind Trump's reevaluation. And so you're going to see a different form of this emerging. But I think much in the way that when the British Empire tried to rebrand itself in the 20s and the 30s as the Commonwealth, it only speeded up the process of disintegration. I
Yeah.
think this is only going to speed up the process of disintegration, not only of the US, but for the other imperial powers as well. So Britain in particular, France, Germany,
Mm.
are all going to find themselves very adversely impacted by this reevaluation. What do you think about that?
Well, absolutely, and I think it's. I was stunned by the wording of this executive order, and if you just, it's just like the section one of
Mm,
this of the executive order putting a pause on US foreign aid. Of course, mostly it's not all over the world. Israel is going to continue receiving aid, of course,
mm,
as is Turkey. Interestingly, but yeah, it states that in section one, the purpose of this executive order is the US foreign aid industry and bureaucracy are not aligned with American interests and in many cases antithetical to American values. They serve to destabilize world peace by promoting ideas in foreign countries that are directly inverse to harmonious and stable relations internal to and among countries. Like I could have written this as someone who has written about like the corrupting influence that NED and USAID and this other kind of alphabet soup of Western foundations and intelligence cutouts
mm,
operating all over the world, which I have written about extensively. They are not only harmful to the beneficiary quote unquote countries, i.e., the colonial satrapies that are in the crosshairs of the West, but they're also really damaging for Western countries themselves, particularly the US. Like the NED and USAID with CIA direction often undercut official US government policy all the time.
mhm,
Like it is forgotten, right, that in 1991, the Bush administration, the George Bush Sr., he was desperately trying to preserve the Soviet Union as the Commonwealth of independent states because they were worried about a situation like Yugoslavia, which is to say the eruption of bitter ethnic civil wars, but with nuclear weapons in the mix.
mm.
Okay, and so this was the official policy of the Bush administration. They were working really hard to try and help Gorbachev achieve this. And in the background, NED was funding every separatist group it possibly could in the Soviet Union.
But does
Like
that
it,
does that not then recall the words of a certain Colonel, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman at Trump's first impeachment trial, which is
hmm,
that Trump had gone against the official foreign policy of the United States, meaning that there is what a president wants, and then no matter what party that president belongs to. And then there are the priorities of the US imperial system, which are different. So George H.W. Bush, being a career intelligence man, may well, as you say, have been concerned. And I think that's quite think he probably is. He probably is right. He was wanting to stop an uncontrolled demolition, but the actual reality of the interests of the U.S. ruling class, as expressed through its intelligence networks, through its NGOs, which are run by intelligence networks, was fuck it, let's blow it up. You know,
Yeah,
basically. Same
yeah.
with the Ceausescu-led government in Romania. Same with Yugoslavia, which is you had one set of ideas coming from the elected government, the official government, but the real policy was what was being pursued by CIA, USAID, NED. And so it's interesting that Trump apparently, or whoever wrote this, I don't think Trump wrote it himself, but some people in the Trump orbit have
Mm.
taken on board some of this. And I think that to it to be sold to Trump, it is partly the Vindman effect of essentially Vindman coming out and confirming what every person branded as a conspiracy theorist for the last 60 years plus has said, which is there is this permanent bureaucracy which exists in every imperialist country, which pursues its own interests or the interests of the ruling class relentlessly, and then governments come and go, and governments can say what they like, but the policy remains.
Absolutely, and I think that it's I think you completely hit the nail on the head when you talk about how the US is not necessarily going to lose interest in these countries. It's just going to lose interest in like the kind of propaganda aspect and the kind
Mm.
of fluffy rules, rhetorical rules-based order stuff, and attempting to make any even basic effort to appear like a rights-driven intersectional empire, as we have
Mm.
discussed in the past. And I think that what's really interesting is that that like actually that an enormous number of these programs that effectively just serve a propaganda service for empire, and in many
Mm.
cases they're not doing a very good job of it. And it's like in a lot of countries in this in my neck of the woods, but throughout Eastern Europe, the majority, if not all, opposition media is funded by the NED or USAID
Mm.
or the Foreign Office or this German CIA foundation that's the CIA front.
Mm.
Like in Slovakia, you have, and we'll get into this, you have Robert Fico, who is extremely popular with the local population. His positions are supported by large numbers, in many cases, an absolute majority of Slovakians. And yet he is routinely and on an hourly basis torn to shreds by local Western-funded media,
Mm.
right? But it doesn't seem to be working anymore. Like in Serbia, the wider Balkans, there is a website called Balkan Insight, which is basically run by the CIA and MI6 to pump out whatever rubbish they want and desire in any particular moment. Balkan Insight has for many years been publishing a pretty much daily stream of negative stories about China due to growing Chinese investment in
Mm.
the Balkans, particularly, if not almost pretty much exclusively Serbia, where rail infrastructure, for instance, in many cases destroyed by NATO during the criminal 78-day-long bombing in 1999, have been rebuilt by the Chinese and been equipped with the highest speed rail in Europe,
Mm.
which is quite extraordinary. And so Balkan Insight, if you go to their website, on their front page, they have this whole they have a section stated called China in the Balkans, and you can click on it, and it's just relentless negative
Mm.
story after negative story about China. In many cases, these stories are complete and utter rubbish, or at best grossly distorted and misleading, and then they get picked up by, say, the New York Times, and it is framed as Balkan Insight, an independent local media outlet. When but it's like as far as I can, it is like the butt of jokes in Serbia.
Mm.
Like nobody reads it. Its
Yeah.
headquarters in Belgrade, and people think it's a joke. Like like it's so they're the empires it is unable to match what China and unwilling, as I think we'll get into, unwilling to match what China is doing, it very tangibly, very practically, very materially.
Hmm.
You know, it's like,
Well,
oh, well, like China's building high-speed rail in Serbia. Let's just pump a ton of money into propaganda to demonize China. Like
well,
that's their only response.
yeah,
You
it's the only
know?
move, and I'm just sharing now on the screen this
Yeah.
tweet you sent me about the parking scheme in Kiev, which I saw this document a couple of years ago. I followed the link. The USA document that this is referring to no longer exists. It's been taken off the
Yeah.
web. I'm
Oh,
sure I'll have to get hold of it via the Wayback Machine. I did have it on
you
another.
can do. You can
Yeah.
do. You can do. Yeah.
But this is an example because I want to just jump off this for a moment because
Yeah.
this is an example of what US aid and the NED are really designed to do, which is they are designed to find every single possible area for wealth extraction in a particular country and
Yes.
parasitize it, meaning feast off it, essentially. So whether it is as ridiculous as Technical Assistance for Parking Management Initiative in Kiev, which recommends more fines and higher fines, surprisingly enough, but paid a whole shitload of management consultants a ton of money to tell you this, of course. Now, this sounds like a joke, and indeed it should be treated as one to a large degree, but it's emblematic of the bigger game, which is that these countries, be it Ukraine, Bosnia, or a place like Macedonia, Montenegro, the micro non-state known as Kosovo,
Hmm.
Albania itself, all of these states have been reduced to a status of pure dependency and also to be sites of pure wealth extraction down to the tiniest individual level. That's what they're there to do. And because US British imperialism are so degenerate, like they don't even do the things that when we were kids, for instance, and the subject of British colonialism came up, if indeed it ever did in school. Sometimes it did. The old generation of teachers, and bear in mind I was at school in the early 90s, would always say, "Ah, yes, but Britain built railways in India." Well, it built a couple to better facilitate extraction of wealth from the
Yeah.
country. But they don't even
Mm.
do that anymore. They
Yeah.
don't even do that anymore. What they do is extract wealth, create parasitic systems with whole network of local clients who are dependent upon this wealth extraction operation for their livelihoods, and they build nothing. This is what to draw from what you were saying. They build nothing. So when you compare that to what the Chinese example, and we'll come to the Deepseek question later on, where the Chinese go and build railways, they build infrastructure. Yes, they build stuff that helps them in terms of doing deals for getting hold of resources from a country, but they do so in a way that, of course, is non-imperialist and is not parasitic because they are helping the industrial development of a country. Like imperialism, even when it builds one or two facilities, like I'll give the example of the French in Mali. The French in Mali built extraction facilities for uranium in the uranium mines and also some gold mining extraction facilities as well. Now, did they build up a wider industrial infrastructure inside Mali? No. Did they help the Malians build up their transport infrastructure? No. Did they help build the technical, scientific, and educational base of the country? No. This is when imperialism builds a mine, an oil rig, gas extraction operation. It is purely based around just that. So you get a tiny island of industrialization in a sea of underdevelopment, in a sea of de-development, de-industrialization, asset stripping. When the Chinese move into an area and work with a government, they work to build up what is in essence a much wider industrial, educational, and infrastructural base. That is a different game to the games of British and American and French and German and Italian imperialism. And that must be recognized. So what you've got in Serbia there is the different, if you can just compare what the Chinese are doing in Serbia with what the Americans and the Brits are doing in Bosnia and Kosovo, the difference is night and day. You're muted, mate.
For God's sake, sorry. I think as well that like something that always plays on my mind. And I just it's something which passed like a lot of people by, but I mean I've talked about this a lot. I may well have spoken about this during our previous discussions. That like what one a really interesting insight into the Imperial Brain Trust are papers related to declassified papers related to the Kyoto agreement, which was meant to be this international protocol where countries would have incentives for cutting their carbon emissions. Bill Clinton was really pushing this, but then the US never ratified it, and it's been rather forgotten now. But it was, yes, it was an attempt to create a kind of global concord and framework for on climate change. Now, if you look at the national security, the U.S. National Security Archive has released a large number of papers related to this. You can see that all of the kind of the U.S. Officials at the highest levels, they not only found the entire concept kind of bewildering, this notion that like you could that countries could benefit while the US didn't for cutting their carbon emissions. It's like, well, it's like they don't understand how an incentive structure works. So like they have this completely zero-sum view of the world where if someone else is gaining, we are losing. Whereas like China, again, we have definitely discussed this before, but like China's approach is, yes, it builds infrastructure which Beijing itself benefits from, but it also massively benefits like the countries involved, you know. And so and they are assisting many global South countries to produce their own goods. They are providing them with the technology and the facilities and the factories to, rather than serve as sources of resource rape and pillage for Western powers, which means that the overwhelming majority of the profits from the extraction of, as in 99.9% of the profits of resource extraction end up in the hands of a very select group of Western corporations and oligarchs. They are, assisting like. They're balancing the playing field significantly with like revolutionary effects across Africa, and it is this zero-sum mindset, which means that the US, despite endless, almost annual promises to set up a comparable international infrastructure building project to rival One Belt, One Road or Silk Road or the various names for China's international infrastructure building effort. It's why it will never happen, because like if in any way a quote unquote beneficiary country is profiting at US expense, they're not going to go for it. And it's again, as we've discussed before, what's really interesting is that the Balkans, because it is a rather complex complex region ethnically, religiously, and historically. The US hasn't even managed to do most of the resource extraction it was hoping to carry out when it broke up Yugoslavia in the 1990s, because the societal issues that it created or exacerbated are too complex to circumnavigate, which is why rather than plundering like real resources, they are pumping enormous amounts of money into monetizing and privatizing parking in Eastern Europe. Like like that's the easy return from their perspective. So it's I think it's I mean, as astonishing as it is, this withdrawal of US aid, and it's like, and it starkly underlines how across much of the world, most civil society organizations, independent media outlets, activist groups, and NGOs
Mm.
are almost entirely dependent on US funding to
Yes.
exist.
Mm.
And it's like, I mean, like, organizations like Stonewall, which
Yes.
is, probably the most famous, or like, the most kind of well-established gay rights organization in the world. Like their biggest funder was the US government. Now that's been cut. They are rattling the begging bowl and asking European countries to make up the shortfall.
I doubt they'll be
Because that
successful, to be completely honest, because um, to just to look at an example of like where the US investment in color revolutions goes. Of course, we have the recent protests against Fico in Slovakia, following Fico taking what I will describe as the only decision that or the only potential decision that he could really look at taking, which is that the EU, mainly the Germans with the backing of the Americans and the British, have basically like tried to fuck over his government on a number of different ways, including by backing up Zelensky's cutting off of the gas supply from Russia through Ukraine, which is adversely affecting Slovakia. But also, I think the small matter of trying to have him assassinated probably didn't make him feel too positive towards certain characters in the EU and Britain.
Mm.
And that, as you revealed, the wannabe assassin had a past with Western intelligence services, and I don't think that's just a past. I think that's a present as well. So according to Politico and other outlets, of course, yeah, 100,000 are out protesting against Fico for his pro-Putin turn, which of course is ridiculous. It's not a pro-Putin turn. It's just a decision, the only decision that you can be left with if you're serious about any remote amount of sovereignty for a country like Slovakia, which is that as Josef Skala, the Czech communist who I'm familiar with, said in a recent meeting held in London, and has said repeatedly before, Czechoslovakia, when it was one country, had a bigger industrial base. It had a higher level of scientific, technological, and educational development. Since it was deceptively brought to an end, the socialist system there in 1989 by Václav Havel and others, some of whom are still kicking around and are still employed by the same people, promising all kinds of things to the Czech and Slovak working class, not delivering any of them, getting color revolution at various times in the 90s, as you've talked about before, Slovakia that is, losing much of the industrial base and technological base that used to exist under the socialist system, and being delivered into the tender mercies of the EU, who furthered deindustrialization and asset stripping of Slovakia and the Czech Republic. But we're dealing with Slovakia now. Now Fico, who is popular, seeks to start to turn this around. And of course, all the, I'm going to call them very misguided people, I'm being charitable there, many of whom will be either employed or will have received some kind of benefit from the US, British, etc., color revolution operations in the country, are all out screaming blue murder. But these people have nowhere to go, because the thing that they're demonstrating for, as we've been talking about, this is coming to an end. There's no more roads to go down here. Pretty soon there might not be an EU in its current form. So this is the dog end. This is the fag end of things very much in Slovakia, and I don't think it's going to succeed. But what's your take on it?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, yeah, we have discussed in the past. Like Slovakia was one of several. This is rather forgotten now. Several countries in Central and Eastern Europe that did not want to give up every shred of its communist system and did not want to open itself up to Western domination and subjugation. And breaking down those political and economic barriers required civil society penetration, enormous amounts of money spent on NGOs and other chaos agents, and a color revolution in the late 90s, all sorts of meddling and propaganda campaigns to get the country into the EU and NATO. And it's like, yeah, I mean, this Politico article, I mean, I'm both appalled but not surprised by a lot of their language when they refer to how Fico's government has taken a quote unquote sharp foreign policy turn towards Moscow, which is to say it has exhibited a sliver of autonomy which it didn't exhibit before, and this is unacceptable. But the only response is to try and do what they've done before, and people are wise to it now. I mean, we saw this in Georgia, where there were multiple attempts to put. I mean, in 2003, the US pulled off a color revolution in Georgia, known as the Rose Revolution. They tried to do that again multiple times after the hitherto pro-Western, pro-EU, pro-NATO Georgian Dream Party dared pass a law compelling foreign funded organizations in Georgia, of which there are tens of thousands, and the experience of these multiple color revolution attempts, but b an EU commissioner openly telling Georgian leaders that they could get shot like Fico if they're not careful. Suddenly the Georgian Dream government is like have been transformed into the anti-imperialist heroes for refusing to back down, but they have provided a palpable demonstration of how you stave off an attempted color revolution. And it's like, you know, I've been following events in Slovakia very, very closely lately, and it's like, you know, the organizations involved in this are very transparent in terms of distributing leaflets and brochures and explainer manuals on non-violent resistance and all sorts of other color revolution techniques, and they're doing so out in the open, and trying to claim that, well, you know, we're not trying to overthrow the government. You know, we're not doing anything. We're not doing anything underhand or illicit here. I mean, save for the people who filled the streets of Bratislava, I don't think anyone else in the country is going to fall for it this time. You know, like, so we are at the fag end of this. And I mean, I also wrote an article which blew up a bit on my personal website, just in the manner of a shameless plug, that the NED has now taken its grant database offline, which the NED was specifically set up and avowedly set up, in the words of its own top brass, to do publicly what the CIA once did covertly, which is to fund trade unions and activist groups and opposition media and all this other stuff, but do it out in the open with, and now they've been forced underground again. So it's like, we're back to square one in terms of, well, actually, open US funding is now a kiss of death that covert CIA funding was 30 years ago.
Yes.
And yeah, like, people are very, very, very wise to it. And I might add as well, I mean, like I mentioned with Serbia, one of the reasons these crowds might be so big is because the NGOs that these people work for suddenly don't have any money coming in, and nobody's getting paid, and no one has anything to do. So you're going to protest. Like, but I mean, as kind of exhilarating as this is, I do think, and this kind of feeds neatly into our next section. Like, I do think that, or at least a subsequent section, that, like, the US approach now is going to probably just be blunt force. Like, they're going to drop all pretense of rights and wanting to improve countries. It's going to be raw, naked imperialism writ large. Um,
Well, as Donald Trump says, we're gonna stop getting ripped off by all these countries, and that means we're going to start openly ripping them off without the mask on. And it took the U.S. ruling class about 7 or 8 years to come round to this point of view, but now they're there, which in actual fact isn't going to do them any good. It's only going to speed up the imperial decline because you can't stop this now, just like they can't stop the Chinese industrial and technological development. It's like they can't disguise the fact that the Russian armed forces are significantly better than their own. This decline, now the US is just basically going to stick a ski mask on and begin sticking a gun in people's faces. That's only going to speed up the decline, you know? Out with the pride flag, in with the AR-15, AR-14, or whatever it's called. So shall we then move to another area where the US is and the British game is very much coming to be up soon, which is, of course, our long-term story that we've been covering for a while, which is the ever-evolving collapse of Ukraine. If we move over to that, and according to no less a person than Kirill Budanov, the psychotic lunatic who was in charge of Ukrainian military intelligence, and this is according to both Russian and Ukrainian sources, has said in a recent contributions at a Ukrainian government meeting that it's 6 months left, chaps, basically, and then game's over, which I think is, according to everything I've read on this seems to be the case. If it is indeed true that various elements of foreign aid, including bits to Ukraine, are being choked off at source by the Trump administration, it seems that what some in the US administration want to do is to cause this thing to go down and then step away from it and essentially say, well, wasn't our fault. It was that Biden guy. It's his idea. He was ripping off Ukraine all the way along. All we did was just end Biden's fraud, and ain't on us. Let's go and try something else, etc. So, only thing I'm surprised is that it was Budanov who came out and said this. But as with the likes of Arestovich, a lot of these guys all know that they're lying and have known that they had never had any chance of winning. Now the end is in sight. It seems that some of them are looking to get out while the going's still good, or when it's still possible to get out. But what's your reaction to Budanov's words? And good of him to back up our predictions, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's just like that. It's not only Bogdanov, but I mean, a large number of Ukrainian officials recently have effectively said the same, that all we are doing now is holding on to territory by the skin of our teeth, and we're not doing a good job of it.
Mm.
Like we're taking horrendous losses as the Russians just relentlessly move forward. The last time that there was a real kind of propaganda blitz in the media, the kind of pro-Ukraine propaganda blitz, which has already been completely forgotten in record time. At the start of January, we were told there was going to be a renewed offensive in Kursk, which is, as we've discussed before, Kursk was to all intents and purposes, a British operation. It was planned by the British. The British did a lot of the training. They provided an enormous amount of equipment that was used for this invasion of Kursk, and they openly advertised their central involvement in this in order to try and compel other countries to become overtly involved in this. There was, of course, that Time article that we discussed last week, which explicitly stated that Biden was determined that this not become a hot war. I'm convinced, based on the leaked documents and emails that we've reported on at the Grey Zone, that yes, that the British were hoping, believed the US would go all in on this. And they haven't, and they've steadfastly refused to do it. And so, like it's all coming apart. Zelensky, in a recent interview, I noted he asked whether a deal had been cut between Putin and Biden when they met in Switzerland before the conflict. I forget whether this was a few months before the proxy war erupted. I suggested at the time in February 2022 that this could have been the result because both sides stood to benefit from this in different ways to varying degrees. We even spoke about this at the time, which is nearly 3 years ago now. My, how time flies. But I'm not fully sold on that. But for Zelensky to come out and say it is really quite extraordinary, even if it's a post hoc rationalization of why he managed to be conned into thinking that he wouldn't be the next Gaddafi. Or the next in the long line of former US puppets who got thrown under the bus when it was expedient for Washington. And so it's quite clear that there is an ongoing that there is like an ongoing internal power struggle. I strongly suspect that on top of the conflict having 6 months or less left, I think that Zelensky's probably got a few weeks left at this stage. He will he will either be killed or spirited out of the country to London.
Well, yes. I mean, if we think about just what is his position based on, I mean, he is not well liked by the various different fascist elements that exist in Ukraine. He is tolerated because he is seen as the US and the British government's man. And he's the man who essentially brings in the loot to be distributed through this sort of clientelist system that is operated out of the Kiev regime to keep these various different factions inside Ukraine on side. And if he's not seen as the guy who can bring in the money anymore, if he's not the US's chosen man anymore, well, then your shelf life is very short because the people around him are not fond of him and never have been. So if he's losing it, then and his authority is draining away, won't be long before somebody decides to get rid of him. And he may well be advised to cash in whatever chips he's got left and leave for a life of exile on the talk show circuit in the United States, doing carpool karaoke with James Corden or doing his piano playing trick with Stephen Colbert, because that's a much better outcome, however undignified that might be, than ending up, shall we say, with the Mussolini treatment, upside down from a lamppost, etc. Couple of other things just on this story. It seems that there has been an intensification of partisan activity across Ukraine over the last 18 months or so. I think certainly since the failure of the much vaunted Zaporozhye offensive, and probably going back earlier than that, there has been a consistent guerrilla level struggle inside the bits of Ukraine that are nominally controlled by the Kiev regime. And this includes, of course, resistance to mobilization. It includes killing and chasing out of town military recruiters and press gang operations. But as you wrote about actually in 2023 for an article you published in Al Mayadeen, it could also include things like killing foreign mercenaries, killing foreign military instructors. Now, you opened up this article with a commentary on the death of a guy called Daniel Burke, who was a British mercenary who'd been active in Ukraine, who disappeared without trace and then popped up dead later on. So some of this might be infighting inside the mercenaries themselves, not exactly a loyal bunch by any means, and always bordering on just outright criminality. But I think some of this is certainly underground activity by partisan operations, identifying dangerous mercenaries or notorious mercenaries, and essentially luring them into traps and offing them, which, of course, Ukraine has a history of going back to the Soviet era. So it would seem that not only is Zelensky's authority draining away and the splits at the top are getting worse, but also the organized resistance to them on the ground has been intensifying, certainly over the last 18 months, perhaps longer now. So I think you're right. It is a matter of weeks for him, and with him gone, I think that's the gravitational force that has existed in the Kiev regime will all start to go. It will unravel, and I think when it does unravel, it'll be relatively quick in terms of the implosion. But what's your take on that?
Well, yeah, absolutely, and I think that the mobilization issue. I mean, there's been an enormous amount of speculation about whether, and I think Trump has openly stated that he supports Ukraine opening up mobilization to Ukraine's 18 to 24-year-old demographic, and this has been interpreted by many people as a sign that Trump wants to keep this going. I actually think this might be Trump playing Zelensky, because if you look at basic demographic data from before the war, and bearing in mind that an enormous number of people have fled. I mean, quite what the country's full population, remaining population is today isn't clear. That, I mean, as you mentioned, there have been attacks on the mobilization crews. The mainstream media has reported that there are entire cities and towns and even regions in Ukraine that don't have male populations because everyone's either been conscripted or fled conscription. So it's I noted in late 2023 that there was this rather bizarre phenomenon of, yes, foreign mercenaries, but also Ukrainian soldiers turning up dead in very, very, very strange circumstances, which it appears in at least some instances, Ukrainian authorities have sought to actively cover up and lie about how, in the manner of when we hear about Polish military officials dying in strange circumstances, which is code for they were in Ukraine and got calibrated by the Russians. I strongly suspect that there has always been since 2014 an underground within traditionally Russian and majority Russian speaking areas like Odessa and Kharkiv, who have carried out sabotage, reconnaissance, and this might now be extending to targeted assassinations. And there are multiple interviews with foreign mercs who have fought in Ukraine, who say that, well, we were deployed in Donbass, and it was clear that the population saw the Russians as liberators. They didn't want us to rescue them, quote unquote, and they were making our life very difficult by passing information to Russian forces. And even the mainstream media has on very rare occasions acknowledged that there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of people in the areas which are in Russia's sights, the Russian military sites, as it were, where local residents have turned down offers of evacuation because they're waiting for the Russians to get there.
Yes.
There was a BBC report recently on this where there was just it was focusing on contested areas where there were just people were just like, well, we don't really care whether we're part of Ukraine or Russia, or have actively openly stated, well, we want to be absorbed into Russian territory. So this is another reason why the war is unraveling at a rate of knots. And it is, I think, that at the time that I wrote that article, which is was at the tail end of 2023, I think this has only gotten worse over time, and it's going to get increasingly more difficult to keep covering up
Mm.
The extent of this. There are some commentators who have noted that there has been an uptick in partisan, kind of anti-Ukrainian, pro-Russian partisan activity in many areas.
Yes. And this, of course, goes all the way back, as Colonel Jacques Beau pointed out recently, to 2014, with the pro-Russian, in some cases, pro-Russian nationalist, in some cases, pro-Russian communist uprising across what the region that Putin now openly refers to as Novorossiya. And the Russian special forces, according to Jacques Beau, were actively training partisan forces before they would did a tactical withdrawal from Kherson City. So there's a lot of these guys out there who have been by one means or another trained by the Russians in sabotage and hit and run operations, and they'll be increasingly active as the Ukrainian state starts to fall to pieces. So we will see where that story goes. Nowhere good for Mr. Zelensky and his friends, I do not think. Now, I do wonder if, as you said before, when this comes to an end, whether that will also be the end of a certain Sir Keir Starmer's political career, because, of course, he has lashed himself to this, like Odysseus being lashed to his own mast, so he can avoid the call of the sirens. In this case, the siren voices being anybody who would dare speak against the holy war waged by Sir Keir in Ukraine. But certainly it would be convenient for the British establishment to pin it all on him and shuffle him off to the House of Lords and replace him with somebody else. We will be coming back to this story later on. In fact, there are other elements of this where we will be talking about how certain people in Britain just wish that the US would pretend some more. Like a failing marriage, why don't you pretend anymore, darling? You could at least fake it. But we will come back to Mr. Rory Stewart later on. And his rather strange ideas, I think it's fair to say. He's a man who is probably one of the more obvious intelligence plants in the British parliamentary system in the past. But turning to the subject of Chinese advance, and more specifically, a Chinese, I think it's fair to say, win this week, which is related to the $476 billion wiped off the stock price of Nvidia, and that's not counting the many billions that got wiped off other stocks. This is, of course, the story of Deepseek, the Chinese-produced AI app, which I have been trying out in preparation for this. Now, if you're not familiar with this story, this is the story of how essentially the Chinese industrial and tech system has outperformed the decaying, rotting US and British tech system. By the way, Sir Keir Starmer says Britain's going to be an AI powerhouse. This story reveals just how far removed from reality Sir Keir really is. Because the Chinese produced Deepseek, which is operating at least on a par with the most advanced US AI systems. This was produced apparently using a lower level of technology in terms of the microprocessors involved in it, and also with for a grand total of $6 million. So if you can produce something which is as good as Deepseek is and can do as many complicated operations as Deepseek can, not just in terms of answering questions, but also programming, for writing programs even, then that renders the over-expensive, overproduced, wasteful systems produced by the United States, well, it renders them rather irrelevant, and could deal a fatal blow to this entire over-bloated sector, which, as others have pointed out, the tech sector in the United States is not only very wasteful, but has been based fundamentally on US state largesse for a very long time, be it Google getting its startup from DARPA, or be all of these companies being integrated into the US military intelligence and defense base. Trump just the other day was announcing $500 billion investment into AI security infrastructure, which I believe independent journalists in the US have covered, such as Whitney Webb and others, talking extensively about how this is literally like the thing that Trump said he stood against. He's doing some of extensively, which is like advancing the power of the AI, all-seeing eye, deep state. But the whole thing could be knocked into a cocked hat by this Chinese advance. But Kit, were you at all surprised to see this happening, or just did you, from your Balkans vantage point, just laugh and move on?
Well, I mean, it was a bit of both, but like, I mean, I do think I was keeping an eye on this because
Mm.
I do think that, I mean, yeah, as you state, that there is an important point to make, which is not only is the US tech sector heavily dependent on US government funding, and indeed a large number of household names, including, I mean, the most obvious example being Amazon or, like, say, Microsoft. The most profitable parts of their business are contracts with the NSA, the CIA, the Pentagon. Like, it's not their consumer facing divisions
Mm.
that make the most money. And I think that, yeah, as well. The mainstream media has even reported on how there are a number of people around Trump, including his pick for CIA chief John Ratcliffe, who have had previously or currently have financial interest in AI.
Mm.
So, because that's meant to be the new game in town, but it's like, again, I think that there is a fundamental as difference in terms of approach, where it's to AI, where yes, China has launched a free, like a cheap open source alternative, which undercuts pretty much the entirety and outperforms almost the entirety of the US AI industry. The US was for a very long time, boasting about how it had an edge over every country in the world combined. In this field, but what they were using it for was usually something to do with killing people
Mm.
via the military-industrial complex, or again, yes, the CIA, or the FBI, or for spying on people. They were using it for malign purposes, and then farming it out to the general public when they found some way of monetizing it, or trying to frame elective surveillance measures, like Amazon's Ring variety of products, which basically spy on you and record you while you're at home.
Mm.
That's not China's approach. We are told about China's obsession with surveillance and monitoring its own population. That's not the kind of products China is putting on the market. These are exactly the kind of products that US government funded intelligence agency connected firms are putting out.
Mm.
Or are trying to innovate in. I mean, the Nvidia crash as well is that I think it's another important point to make here is that Nvidia was considered almost too big to fail.
Mm.
It was it was a leading, if slightly lesser known, um, tech giant, and it's the only tech giant, or one of the last remaining tech companies in the US, and that means the wider West as well, because as we've discussed, Europe only self-identifies as having a tech sector. It doesn't actually have one. It doesn't actually have one.
Mm.
Nvidia was one of the kind of the last, or one of the last firms that was actually making something tangible.
Yes.
It was the last one of the last US based companies that was making physical products. The rest is most of the rest of the tech sector is concentrated in non-physical products, or products which are say in the case of iPhones, dependent on foreign labor and parts and all manner of things to make. They're not made
Mm.
in the US, and the US doesn't have may not have the technological or capabilities, or even like staff capable
Mm.
of making an iPhone at this stage.
Yes.
because it's all been outsourced. So Nvidia was this kind of last holdout. The hit to its share price is absolutely massive. And yes, it raises all sorts of questions about how and indeed whether the US can respond in any meaningful way. But because there are people within Trump's orbit who have these financial interests in AI, it is likely they'll try.
Hmm. Yes, I mean, I'll make a prediction, which I don't think is particularly bold, but Trump came out and made what is a statement that his backers will probably not thank him for, where he said that, well, they've produced this for $6 million, and isn't that good? Because we can get something that good, but for much less. And you could almost hear the chorus of his former friends screaming, "No, it's not, Mr. President. We need to spend another 500 billion, making it $1 trillion on AI security integration systems or something like that." Because the response to this will be that a bunch of Trump's friends will go to him, I think, and say, "Mr. President, on the basis of the need to preserve our AI-oriented national security, the program you announced on the end of last week will need to be doubled in price." And we'll need the following contracts agreed with the following people. And the US government will need to backstop the entire tech sector because we are literally too big to fail. And by the way, did we mention that China's going to eat our lunch if we don't do this? And Trump will then go before Congress and announce we're going to war on the AI front. And a gigantic package will be announced. Somehow it will produce even less than a $6 million investment in China, and a whole bunch of people will get new big houses in the Virginia suburbs. Kit, how am I doing on the predictions so far, do you think?
I'm looking at like next week that you will be vindicated on this front, and it's like it's just this is the thing as well is that like the pace of change in China is just like is unimaginable just in terms of like in every they are ahead. If you look at like statistics in terms of patents, in terms of academic papers
Mm,
published on in pretty much every field of science and technology, China has produced more than any other country. They are ahead in
mm,
most fields, and it's only really now that the US is realizing that it doesn't have this edge that it
mm,
thought it did. And it's also at a point where they realize that we've been investing in the wrong things and focused on the wrong things. Is that going to result in them actually making sensible decisions? No, it isn't.
no.
For the reasons that we've discussed. And it's like, not long after Deepseek, and yeah, you've got the story up on the screen, I see. Like, not long after Deepseek basically destroyed the US artificial intelligence, the entire AI industry,
Mm,
which we've been told by most quote unquote serious sources is going to be the future of and going to revolutionize everything. The Chinese have now launched satellites that beat Elon Musk's much vaunted Starlink
yes.
in terms of transmitting satellite data to Earth. And then, someone I saw someone on Twitter saying, "Can the Chinese just stop for like 5 minutes?" And to which I responded, "No, they literally can't." Like
No.
they, there was, I've reported this is something that we've discussed repeatedly on the show, but I do think it bears repeating that last July, and this passed everyone, including myself at the time, by there was this Rand report,
Mm,
which effectively stated, which was a review of the 20 much vaunted again 2022 Pentagon National Defense Strategy, which the Rand report found that it was repeatedly assumed throughout this national defense strategy that the US had the edge over China in most, if not all, key fields.
mm,
And Rand finds that this is just completely untrue.
yes.
But then their only prescription for dealing with it is print more money
Yes.
and try
And
and reindustrialize. Like,
well, and herein lies a problem, a fundamental problem, which is that I mean the reason why what Kit says about the escalating Chinese dominance in so many areas, including like the things like academic papers, patents issued, things like that, is that what the US thought it could do, and following Britain, by the way, the British ruling class did the same thing. They thought that they could maintain certain areas of high technology production and keep them to themselves, keep the dominance in there, whilst deindustrializing everything else. Now, the truth is, you can't separate out your scientific and technological research base from your wider industrial base, at least not for very long, because the two naturally feed off each other. So if you've outsourced all the production and it's all being done elsewhere, a lot of it in China or in Vietnam or in Indonesia or in India, well, then essentially what you are doing is you have cut yourself off from further innovation, really. And the Chinese, of course, having the most flexible system along possibly with the Vietnamese as well, having their system that enables them to sidestep the traditional problems that come along with a market economy in certain respects. So getting over the property bubble that they had that was caused by their stimulus in response to the 2008 crisis, getting around that with relative ease, despite every dickhead in The Economist for years saying, "Oh, China, not long now, going to fall." And they just basically changed their housing policy, made some adjustments, and carried on. And The Economist, of course, does it reflect upon this? No, The Economist's not reflected on anything since 1831. Why would it start now? So, but
I mean, I might add as well that like it's really interesting that like it's not quite up there in terms of profusion with China does amazing thing, but at what cost? But like there has been a series of stories which I've kind of been collating that intermittently come along, which try and frame China as an awful place to do business because you can't become insanely rich. Personally, and like it's that I saw recently that the fact that there was some I think it was probably The Economist. I mean, where else? or some dickhead thereof was saying if you look at the stats, China is set to lose a large number of millionaires, and that shows that the country's actually getting poorer. And no, it is a sign that the country is actually getting much richer overall because the money is not being concentrated in the hands of very, very, very few. Like, you know, and it is a hard sell, but by God, the Wall Street Journal and The Economist will try and push this to Western audiences as a really bad thing.
Yes.
You know, it's like they're carrying out a cultural genocide against oligarchs.
Well,
it's
the worst kind of cultural genocide of all. Who's going to buy the Harrods Hampers kit? Have you thought of that?
Oh, I know. Well, I mean, and that's. I mean, this is. I mean, but yeah, this is the thing is that the lack of expertise or just lack of like just basic knowledge of China. Like there's that. What's that Chinese? There's a Chinese chat app that's been launched. I forget its name now. What is it?
Oh, Red Note.
Yes, right. Okay. So on Red Note, where it's like, like all of these Americans who've like hopped on Red Note to speak to effectively get Chinese pen pals are getting red pilled on communism. It's like quite it's like quite amazing. And then like there was this one person who said, "Oh, China, come and save us, please, like liberate us in the US." And then this Chinese user responded, "Well, we have this ancient saying in China, which is if you break an egg from the outside, it's a meal. If you break it from the inside, it's a life." Oof. And it's like these people are having their minds blown. They love this stuff, like and so it's like on top of it's just gotten to the point now where Chinese development and innovation and the opening up of so I mean I think I might have made this point on the show before, but Serbia does not have any trading tariffs or restrictions on trade with China at all. And China has, again, in the spirit of but at what cost, has specifically sought to make consumer goods as cheap as possible. Right?
The bastards.
So Yeah, how dare they? So
Mm.
it's like in Serbia, where people like are a lot of people really struggle to get by, and are reduced to working for subsistence wages for American corporations. They are buying high quality, very the best phones they've ever owned, considerably better than Apple smartphones, like Redmi and Honor for pennies. And it's like, I mean, most people I know personally here have one, or have some, Chinese tech, whether that's like headphones, and it costs them nothing, and it's of incredibly high quality. Of course, the US because of the CIA run nature of many of their Western vassals.
Mm.
Of course, the US has successfully cut off Europe from a lot of this stuff.
Yes.
But across the global south, like across Asia, across outside of the vast majority of the Western world, like China's commitment to providing average people with high quality, low cost goods is starting to filter out. Like they
Yes.
have completely I mean, I read today, I saw that the Deutsche Welle, the German state broadcaster, published an extensive investigation into Germany's the crisis, quote unquote, in Germany's car industry, which not long ago was considered the jewel of Europe, and it
Mm.
was Germany's national industry. They are getting absolutely annihilated.
Mm.
Self-inflicted damage from the anti-Russia sanctions notwithstanding, the Chinese can produce vast volumes of often self-driving electric vehicles, within in the span of an hour via
Mm.
automation, and then that is sold on not for profit. Or at least a tiny bit of profit, which is then shared among the wider population. So it's like this is truly revolutionary and I think this is in the spirit of gradually then rapidly. We are going to get into a point where we do have, probably outside Western Europe and the US, a total Chinese tech dominance in every field.
Yes. Well, and I think this is a good point to proceed into our final story of this week, which is the tragicomic tale of a certain former British MP and favourite of The Guardian. I think it's fair to say. And the subtitle for this is "Darling, why won't you pretend for me anymore?" Which is, of course, the mournful cry of The Guardian's favourite Tory, a certain Mr. Rory Stewart, who is very upset that Trump just isn't pretending anymore. And here, I think you've selected this for partly humorous reasons, but also I think it's quite telling as to just what level of foolishness and stupidity that the British intelligence and political establishment and media establishment now operates on. So, Kit, why don't you start off by telling us about who a certain Mr. Rory Stewart is and what makes his mourning here quite funny?
Well, yeah, I mean, I just think that, I mean, it is, yes, an amusing note to end on, but I mean, it's also, I think, a deeply serious one, because it does speak volumes about the crisis of Western imperialism, and the potential opportunities and dangers that are created by this, because this is a wonderful insight straight from the horse's mouth into how British elite and, well, Western, particularly Anglo-American elites think. Like it is 280 characters that says so much about a widespread mindset. Now, Rory Stewart is a veteran, pretty much lifelong MI6 operative who turned to politics, was seemingly hell bent on becoming prime minister. When that didn't work out and he got deselected by Boris Johnson for opposing Johnson's Brexit plan, he then launched a campaign to become mayor of London, the centerpiece of which was him asking Londoners to invite him to stay over at their houses.
Weird.
Which was like which was, I mean, this guy is a total weirdo. But it's like, as we've discussed before when we were talking about the hilarious failure of Kamala Harris' presidential campaign, Rory Stewart was all in on Kamala Harris and was boasting that his family, very aristocratic, were thinking of betting £100,000.
I hope they did.
I hope they bet more. Actually, I really hope it was. I mean, it's a drop in the pot for these people. I might add as well that Rory Stewart, he set up, I think it's called the Turquoise Foundation, which is basically an intelligence front in conjunction with then Prince, now King Charles. Like, this is how connected he is, and he was all in on Kamala Harris and was saying ignore any poll that shows that Trump is ahead, and then has had to do this major mea culpa. And when we went over this on the show, and it was hilarious because in his very, very upper class and rarely heard today BBC 1960s accent, he said that he believed that one of the key reasons that he thought that Trump was going to lose was because of some uncouth things that some people said at his rallies. Right, so it's like it's like he thought that was grounds for Kamala Harris having it in the bag. And so, as he states in this tweet, yes, Trump is quite different from almost all previous leaders since the early Middle Ages. He does not even pretend to be acting for just reasons. The impact of this naked abuse of power will be staggering. Now, Rory Stewart, the people who run MI6, they usually come from elite private schools like Eton, and then go to Oxford or Cambridge, and then they get taught to run an empire which doesn't exist and is never coming back. And they get told they get tutored in the nobility of lying, that presentation and perception trumps reality. And so, of course, from his perspective, he's appalled that someone like Trump, who doesn't have any pretense of acting for just reasons, could be elected, let alone enact the policies he was talking about. And he also talks unintentionally, revealingly, I'm sure, he states this naked abuse of power. It's like, well, I mean, it does tend to suggest that Rory Stewart would be totally on board with any and all abuses of power as long as they were correctly presented.
Yes, which basically sums up the British governing clique now, and has done for a long time, which is, as long as it has appropriate optics, it's fine. As long as you can kill millions of people, but as long as it has to be talked about and sold in the right way. So or just not talked about at all. That's the ideal way of doing it. But if you're going to do it, then you have to have the right propaganda. You have to have 1,000 justifications from various different human rights organizations, which, as we covered earlier on, the British government, largely fund and control, but you need to have them. Now, part of this is the mourning for what we began the show talking about, which is the end of this particular iteration of imperialism, the monopolar moment that followed the end of the counter-revolutions of 89 to 91, and the British role within that, which is to basically provide the intelligence, special forces, and bullshitting for the US side, and trying to, as you've covered repeatedly, to use that to try and push the US into backing British interests in various different hotspots around the world. And they can see all of this is crashing down. And it's not just that Trump is crude and rude, even though that's quite funny. It's that, as we were talking about, this represents a material change. The material change is going from the low-risk color revolution option, which is designed to basically turn a country against itself and incite a near state of civil war by dominating civil society on the one hand and running the armed thug groups on the other hand under the table, which is what the Ukraine model was all about. It's moving from that to just literally gun in the face, give me your shit. You know, hey Denmark.
Ski masks at the ready, and it's like, yeah, and it's like, and I think that if you go to the second tweet as well, which is
Yeah.
one of the, it's something that he posted that MI6 officer turned politician Rory Stewart followed up with. He stated, in response to someone saying it's just the return of the West returning to using hard power. It's probably the last 30 years that is the anomaly. Rory Stewart responded by saying, no, neither the Soviet Union nor the USA ever expressed themselves in this way. They at least pretended to be doing it for a higher cause. And it's like, again, he is like driving home the fact that, like, even if you have the worst motives and objectives in the world,
Mm.
as long as they are wrapped up in sufficient language and layer upon layer upon layer of propagandistic, self-aggrandizing bull and mythologizing bullshit, it's fine. But
Yes.
also, what he says is completely untrue. Now, this is something that a lot of people have passed a lot of people by. But in the 19 following World War II, governments were, particularly the US, were very, very open about the fact that their fight against quote unquote communism was explicitly driven by a desire to get their hands on the resources of countries that were drawn to communism or might be within the Chinese or Soviet or even Yugoslav orbit. Okay, and so you have this address from Eisenhower in August 1953. This is, when they're overthrowing Mossadegh in Iran, and he explicitly states, well, the US can't back away from Southeast Asia because how else would the free world hold the rich empire of Indonesia?
Mm.
We need to block communist incursions into this region. When the US votes 400 million, which was a lot of money at the time, to help the then French-led invasion of Vietnam, where there were US and British advisors on the ground, laying the foundations for the ruinous Vietnam War 20 years down the line. He said, we are voting for the cheapest way that we can prevent the occurrence of something that would be of the most terrible significance for the US, our security, our power, and our ability to get certain things we need from the riches of Indonesian territory and from Southeast Asia. Okay, so like he is being completely overt about what the forces and motives that drive US foreign policy. And since then, we have had a number of examples where basically by accident, US officials have let the cat out of the bag. Like when Alan Greenspan, who was the head of the Federal Reserve for many years, he openly stated, well, of course, the Iraq war is all about oil. And then once, due to backlash, it was like, oh, I actually didn't mean it.
No,
And then
when I said oil, I meant human rights. So
yes,
it's a slip of the tongue. That
no.
happens to you if you read too much Ayn Rand.
Yeah, well, my autocorrect is always, messing up when I try and try and talk
Oh
about
yeah,
oil, but
yeah.
and inserts human rights and democracy. But there was also, and I mean, this is close to home, literally close to home for me. Strobe Talbot, who was a advisor to the Clinton administration during the bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, he openly stated and wrote in the introduction to a book about the bombing of a laudatory account of the US criminal bombing of Yugoslavia, that, well, what best explains NATO's war is not the alleged suffering of Kosovo Albanians, but Yugoslavia's resistance to the broader trend of economic and political reform in the region, which is to say that Yugoslavia was the last holdout in Eastern Europe and the kind of quote unquote former communist sphere that had elements of a socialist system in place, and it therefore needed to be destroyed. by NATO, and they used a pretext for it. And again, when there was pushback against this, he said, "Oh, I actually didn't mean it."
Nah,
But
just banter, just banter.
yeah, absolutely.
State
Like, but it's
Department
just
banter.
I had my fingers crossed as I wrote this paragraph. But
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, that like it's just but I think that this also touches on something that we have discussed before, and I do think that it is kryptonite for Western power, it's a reflection of the kind of death throes of the current phase of Western imperialism, is that the Rory Stewart and other people within his wider milieu, be they quote unquote journalists or pundits or politicians or intelligence operatives, they genuinely believe that Trump is this outlier, that him saying the quiet part out loud about the reality of the US government and US society and US empire, like such as when Trump openly stated, "We're in Syria for the oil, we've got the oil, and that's all we're interested in," or when the Trump administration attempted to overthrow the government of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, and again they openly stated they were doing this because of Venezuela's oil reserves, which are vast. That like, yeah, that like they have this kind of romantic Pinewood Studios Boys Own Hollywood notion of what history was like. And they have completely deluded conceptions of of their own country's history, and that like it is deeply dangerous, because it means that, like, you know, the British, despite the fact that British military chiefs like openly admit that Britain would last a couple of weeks in a war with Russia,
That's being generous.
which is, you know, probably being generous. You know, like given the casualty rates and the UK's like total reliance on quote unquote status symbols, like having a Trident nuclear submarine that is completely dependent on US assistance to maintain, and they are fixing with super glue, and indeed 2 aircraft carriers which usually travel around with no jets on them, therefore defeating their entire purpose, and a navy that can't shoot on land, and the smallest armed forces Britain has had since the 1700s. You know, it's like, despite all of this, they still have delusions of grandeur. That's where the danger, you know, aspect like really comes in, because they do still think that they remain a major, if not the major world power in the world, when this is just clearly not the case. But also as well, this is the silver lining is that these delusions shatter upon reality. And, you know, we are seeing, as we've discussed, you know, Parsim, about like the war in Ukraine, so much of British strategy and training and the grand plans, which are some of which the Grey Zone has exposed of Britain, they're inspired by like completely fantastical conceptions of what D-Day was and what happened then. They're based on completely delusional beliefs about the success of Special Operations Executive, which is, you know, sabotage behind enemy lines, kind of partisan activity. And, you know, it's and as we've discussed, this is the SOE is venerated in British culture for a reason, with, you know, video games and books and TV shows and you know, like talking this up. Like, you know, they can maintain these fantasies, but they're not going to work in the real world.
No, you can't run a war off the plot from a 1965 comic strip regarding Jack Swordface, heroic SOE operative, dropped behind enemy lines, fighting his way back to Blighty with a woman in one hand and a Lee Enfield rifle in the other. This sort of shit. But then again, this is the kind of garbage that you get on British television these days, with stuff like the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare and the sort of veneration of like Colonel David Sterling, of the founder of the SAS, a man who even I think some of his friends would not describe as a particularly salubrious character. But that guy's been basically sanctified in recent years because this was part of Boris Johnson's big global Britain strategy, reinvigoration of special operations, intelligence operations, small scale but big impact stuff designed to support British influence over the world. Well, it's not working. It's run into the literal minefields of Ukraine, and this is now falling to pieces. And all Rory can do is weep and moan that, well, you know, Trump doesn't send me flowers anymore. But it's over, Rory. I would extend an invitation for you to come and have it out on the podcast, but I fear that if you came here, I wouldn't get rid of you. You look like the kind of man who claims squatters' rights in any seat he turned up in. Right. So this brings us to a close of this particular episode of Decline and Fall. Thank you once again to my comrade and friend in the once and future Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia, Kit Clarenberg, for joining me again this week. Thank you, Kit.
It's always been a pleasure, and I think just like as a kind of in the spirit of Jerry Springer, like you know, as a final thought. I mean, I do as we have discussed with Ari the censorship industrial complex and the fact that despite widespread fears of a fight back, this isn't going to happen because the infrastructure isn't there. I do think that like if so many things that we've discussed in this program speak to imperial weakness. Like it doesn't take very many people like it doesn't take very much effort to tear down the kind of spider web of imperialism. The Western powers no longer have the wealth, the influence, the infrastructure, the technical nous, the muscle to do very much of anything. Of course, wounded animals are always animals are always at their most dangerous when they're wounded. But you know, at the same time, like the infrastructure supporting so much of this stuff, just actually, the second that the US turns off the tap, it vanishes.
Yes.
You know, so whether that's the tech sector, whether that's USA. I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens next and how the Trump administration and its de facto willing or unwilling vassals in Europe how they try and make up for the total loss of influence of their massive reduction in soft power influence in the world. You know, like they can try a blunt force, belligerent alternative strategy, but again, I don't actually think that they have the resources to do it anymore.
No.
So yes, a positive note.
Positive note to end on.
on.
The castle is in fact made of sand. Give it a good kick and it comes down. Kit, we will be returning again next week for another episode of Decline and Fall as we go into the gathering storm of the Trump administration. I hope you can join us again then. But until then, thank you for watching or listening, and we'll see you again soon.
He led it from the richer of evolution. He fought some denomination they died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin. Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty wall, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
전체의 사회 주의를 우리 어떻게 정대로 지키는가를 세계여보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 장군님 백승의 영도 따라서 선군의 붉은 기 그 신념으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 조체의 강중대국을 우리 어떻게 이 땅에 세우는가를 세계여보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 장군님의 뜻을 받들어 불굴의 정신력 그대 장으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다.
Neste